everybody, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm going to be giving lots of advice about watercolours. A couple of days ago, I did an Instagram story where I asked you all for questions about watercolours, what you wanted to know, and I've compiled a list of the most asked questions, and this is going to be great for beginners that are starting out using watercolours. Whilst I'm talking about that and answering all of those questions, there will be a time lapse going on in the background of a blue tick watercolour painting because I've been reading a lot of comments from you guys that want to see more of my paintings from start to finish. So I thought I'd include that in today's video. And just before we get into the video, I want to say a massive thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. I'll be talking a lot more about Skillshare in a couple of minutes, but let's get into those questions. Okay, so let's start off by talking about supplies, and the first question is, which watercolours, sketch paper and brushes do you recommend for beginners? Let's start off by talking about watercolours. I do not think that if you're a beginner you have to go for super expensive professional watercolour sets. As long as you have something that is a student grade, then that will be fine. I don't recommend going for like the £1 watercolour sets at a supermarket or a dollar store because they won't work the same as a normal watercolour set. They might be too chalky and dry and you won't get the right feel for them as you do with normal watercolours. So I do recommend investing a little bit more to get more of a student grade paint, but you definitely don't need to have the most professional set out there. You don't need to spend hundreds of pounds on a watercolour set. Moving on to the paper with watercolours is something that I really do recommend investing a bit of money in. I do recommend having proper watercolour paper and not just cheap printer paper or cheap sketchbook paper. Try and get a paper that is designed for watercolours because obviously with watercolours you're using a lot of water, and if you do not have a paper that's designed for use with water, then you will get that warping and buckling happening a lot, which I'm sure a lot of you guys have experienced. I know even with more expensive watercolour paper, I still experience a bit of warping and buckling sometimes. So I definitely think watercolour paper is something that you should invest in. You can go for a hot pressed watercolour paper, which is smoother, or a cold pressed watercolour paper, which has got a bit more tooth and a bit more texture to it. And then there is a rough paper, which is even more textured. And personally, I like to use the cold pressed watercolour paper. I use the Arches cold pressed watercolour paper, but I'm looking to switch it up because I've gone vegan in the last month and I want to try out some art supplies that are more vegan. Now moving on to the brushes. I'm not too sure about. I haven't used a large amount of brushes, so I'm not sure whether you could get away with using like an acrylic set of paintbrushes or oil paintbrushes because I've only ever used watercolour brushes. Now, when I started off, I didn't use super expensive watercolour brushes. I just spent like £5 getting a synthetic set of brushes and they work really well. I definitely don't think you have to spend, £30 per brush. You can get a nice cheap set and they should work well for what you're using them for. I recommend getting a set of round brushes. I'm sure a lot of you have seen that watercolour artists use different types of brushes. Some are flat, some are round, some are crazy shapes like fans and all of that. But I just use round watercolour brushes and I have got on fine with them. And you can normally get a set of about 5 brushes that are again student grade paintbrushes that will allow you to paint in larger areas and also get in really tiny details as well. Now the next question is, what is the most essential things you need for watercolours? And obviously I've spoke about the paper, the brushes and the paint, which are definitely essentials, but there are some other little things that I would recommend you have when you're starting with watercolours. For example, little things like a water jar, which you'll need for water. I actually recommend having 2 of them because it means that you don't have to change your water as often if you have 2 jars next to each other and you swill off the brush in the first one to get most of the dirty watercolour off, and then you give it a quick rinse in the second one. Also, as well as a water jar, you may want some tissue to blot off your watercolour if you're cleaning your brushes, or something like an old tea towel works great for that, and that's what I'm starting to use so I don't use so much tissue paper. And also the last thing that I would say is pretty essential is some sort of tape. whether that's to create a border or to tape it to the desk. It really helps to prevent warping and buckling, and it just stops the painting from moving around whilst you're working on it and from bleeding out all into the edges, and it just creates that really nice border. The next question is, how do I start as an absolute beginner? I have the supplies but I don't know where to start. And I think this is a common feeling for a lot of beginners when you have everything set out and you're just like, well, what do I do now? And I do recommend just practicing techniques. Don't feel like you have to go into a full painting straight away. It will be really useful for you to play around with those supplies and to get a feel for them and to try the techniques that will help you create your masterpieces. So I recommend doing swatches of the colors that you have. That can be really useful when you're trying to pick mixed colors. If you have a color chart made up of all of the colors that you have, then it's really easy to go and select which color is best for your painting and for each area, because watercolors can definitely look different in the tubes and in the pans compared to when they are mixed out and applied to the paper. So that would be the first thing that I'd do. I'd create a swatch, a color chart. I would also practice techniques, so Google YouTube videos like basic techniques for watercolors and learn the wet on wet technique. That is one of the most used techniques for watercolors that will help you avoid harsh edges. I would learn things like the wet on dry method, so how to create little details with your paintbrush, also how to preserve areas of highlights, and just Google lots of different techniques so that you can practice using your watercolors without having to fear messing up a painting. You don't want to jump straight into a painting and it be intimidating and you lose a lot of confidence. Just mess around with the paint and try these different techniques, and then once you've built confidence and you feel like you know what you're doing, you know how to control the water and stuff like that, then try something a little more adventurous, maybe something like a little landscape or a galaxy painting, something quite simple. Don't jump straight into a portrait because that is the hardest thing to do with watercolors, or something like an animal. Start off slow and build up as you gain more confidence. Now, just before we move on to the next question, let's talk about today's sponsor, Skillshare. So Skillshare is an online learning community with over 25,000 different classes in areas like design, business, technology, and lots more. With Skillshare's premium membership, you can get unlimited access to all of the different classes on the site so that you can join the classes and communities that are just right for you. There are lots of great watercolour classes on Skillshare as well, so if you want to improve your watercolour skills even more, then there are a lot of beginner classes on there where you can learn and build confidence with different watercolour techniques. And me personally, I've been really enjoying looking at the courses for investing and the stock market because that's something that I'm interested in. So there's so many different types of classes available to you. Skillshare is also really affordable. An annual subscription is less than $10 a month, but for the first 500 of you guys that sign up using the link at the top of the description, you will get a 2-month free trial so that you can check it out, see how you get on, take some of the classes, and then see if you want to carry on with the subscription. Thank you, Skillshare, once again for sponsoring today's video. So the next question is simply best advice for beginners. So there's so much that I could give for this, but I'm going to give some tips that I think are really important for beginners to know. Firstly, start with light washes of colour. Don't go straight in with all of your shadows. Build up in layers with watercolour and start from your lightest areas to your darkest. Also, don't feel like you have to paint every single part of the paper. You can leave areas white for highlights because it's hard to get highlights back up once you covered it in paint, so try to preserve those highlights. Also, bear in mind that watercolours look a lot darker and more vibrant when they're wet. I see a lot of beginners getting frustrated because they feel like their watercolours aren't vibrant enough. And normally they look really nice and vibrant when the paint is wet, but as soon as it dries, they do dry lighter and they look a bit more dull. So to counteract that, try not to mix as much water in with your paint. Leave that paint a bit more pigmented, and then when it dries, it will look a lot more vibrant. But keep in your mind that your paint is going to dry a lot lighter than it looks when it's wet. Another tip would be to mix up your colours first, especially if you're using the wet on wet technique, and definitely test them out on a scrap piece of paper because like I said, they can look different in your palette than when they're applied to the paper. So always test your colours and plan what colours you're going to use, where you're going to put them, and plan out where the highlights are in the piece and where the shadows are so that you know which areas to preserve and keep white, and you know which areas need to be the darkest to make that painting pop. The next question is, how do you smoothly blend colours? And with watercolours this can be really tricky because sometimes it feels like the watercolours have a mind of their own. But if you use the wet on wet technique, it becomes so easy for the colours to blend into each other without having any harsh edges. And if you use this technique, you really don't have to try and manually blend them out because the water on the paper that you've already added really helps to blend them out anyway. So what the wet on wet technique is, and I will put a card up above because I've done a whole video talking about this and I really recommend you checking that out. But what it is basically you wet the paper first, the area that you want to paint, with some clean water, and then you go and you can drop your colours onto that area, and because the paper's already wet, the colours will spread and bleed out into each other and it gives you a nice smooth gradient. So I definitely recommend using the wet on wet method if you're struggling with blending your colours. The next question is, what are the pros and cons of pan paint versus tube paint? And I've personally not used watercolours in a tube, I've just used them in a pan, but I can still know the pros and cons of each. So with pans, they are really convenient for traveling with, but you can just take your set, you don't have to take loads of tubes. There also tends to be less waste with the pans because you're just using it straight out of the pan, you're not squeezing out from the tube, and that can lead to waste. Tubes can be really good because it's easier to mix a large quantity of paint at once. I don't think there's any difference in the pigmentation of the colours and the quality, whether you have them in a tube or a pan, they're still going to be the same quality. But it tends to be that the tubes, you can mix up a large quantity faster, which it can be so difficult to do with the little pans, especially if you want to mix up the exact same colour for an area of skin. It's hard to mix that same colour if you've got to do it in multiple loads. So that is completely up to you, it's down to preference. Like I said, the quality is the same for both, but I prefer pans. But like I said, I've never tried tubes. I may try them and I may love them, but for me, I personally use the pans. I find them a lot more convenient and I haven't had a problem with not being able to mix up enough paint before. The next question is how to make skin tones with not a lot of colours. Skin tones is definitely a question that I got a lot of times. So skin tones can be so difficult to mix with watercolors, and I have created a very simple recipe of how you can create a pretty basic skin tone color which looks really natural. And I will leave a card up above so you can properly see that video. But in summary, if you take like a yellow ochre, a red tone and a brown tone and mix them together, you will get a very nice skin tone color. If you add in more yellow, you'll get more of a yellowy undertone. If you add more red, you'll get more of a pink undertone to the skin. And if you add more brown, you'll get a darker tone to the skin. Also, if you add more water to that mixture, then you will get a lighter skin tone, or if you mix in less water, you will get a darker, more opaque skin tone. But that's just a very brief description. I do recommend checking out that video where I properly show you guys how you can mix up lots of different skin tones just using those couple of colours. Next question is, how do you do tiny details? Well, I would simply use a really tiny paintbrush, a round small paintbrush, or you can use a colour pencil, really sharpen it, and that will help you get really tiny details if you're finding it hard to do with a paintbrush. But I've always found that using a really small paintbrush makes that a lot easier. I don't know what else to say, but colour pencils can be a great option too. For example, if you wanted to do eyelashes and you find it hard to have a steady hand with a paintbrush and get them really precise, then you can always use coloured pencils on top of watercolour to add those couple of details. Now, mixing colours can be really difficult, and I know a lot of beginners have the problem with colours getting muddy, and so we have this question of how do you keep from muddying your colours. So for example, if you want to create a darker yellow tone, you don't want to add any colours that are complementary to it, so opposite to them in the colour wheel. If you ever let colours that are opposite to each other in the colour wheel touch, then the colour is naturally going to become very muddy and very dull. For example, if I had a yellow and I tried to add a bit of purple to it, that would completely make it look really muddy and a dirty, weird colour. Because they're opposite to each other, it just doesn't give a nice result. So always try and stay clear of mixing complementary colours together. And the last question that I'm going to answer today is, how do I paint something that is white? Well, normally with watercolours you wouldn't paint it in with the white because, for example, the white watercolour is pretty useless most of the time. Instead, you want to preserve that white of the paper. You want the white of the paper to act as your white paint, if that makes sense. So that's why I said earlier, you don't want to add watercolour everywhere on your paper. You want to leave the highlighted areas white. You want to preserve that area of the paper and not add any watercolour to those areas. Also, to preserve highlights, you can use masking fluid, which is really great for creating like sparkles in water or highlights in the eyes. Basically, anywhere where you know you want it to be completely white, you can add a bit of masking fluid to that area, let that dry, paint over it, and the paint won't touch any of those areas where you've added the masking fluid, and so you'll get a really nice bright highlight. However, if you do your painting and you realise that you've painted over all of your highlights and you need to add them back in, you can use something like a white gouache, which I use quite a lot, or a white acrylic, because I know a lot of you guys might have that instead, and you can use that to add in some opaque white highlights over the top, which will help you to get those highlights back in there. But thank you all so much for submitting your questions. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, there were so many other questions that I didn't get to in today's video, so let me know if you want to see a part 2 of this video or more videos like this. Did you like seeing the time lapse in the background again like I used to do? As I know a lot of you missed that whole process, because normally I just pick chunks from certain pieces of artwork. So let me know what you thought, and do you want to see this type of thing with other mediums as well? Once again, I want to say a massive thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. And if you did enjoy watching me create this blue tip painting and you would like to learn how to create this yourself, then I have got this available as a real-time tutorial over on my Patreon. On my Patreon, you can access over 300 real-time tutorials, all with narration and explanation, where I teach you all of the techniques you need to know for drawing and painting. So with each tutorial, you will get the access to the reference image, the sketch outline, and a full materials list so that you can follow along with me. Like I said, there's over 300 tutorials on there now and new ones added every single month. And just for a small amount per month, you can access all of those tutorials. So I'll leave a link to that in the description as well. Anyway guys, thank you for watching the video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you're new around here, and even tick that bell icon so you do get notified on my future videos. But that is it from me, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye everybody.